You're listening to Bedroom Beethovens, where notable music makers break down stories accompanied by songs and melodies documenting growth through their 10,000-hour journey. And me? Well, my name is Cello, your host.
It's the Bedroom Beethoven Podcast.
Whoa, you just blew my mind because nobody talks about that shit.
Thank you for this. I was looking forward to this chat, man. I love your interviews.
I thank you for what you're doing. It's excellent, and people can continue to learn the stories of these bedroom Beethovens.
How did you find out about this? Are you? Oh my God!
Having something like this to shed light on us is amazing. We really need this documentation. So people like you are definitely needed.
Hey, everybody. Thanks for joining me for another episode. Let's travel from Zimbabwe all the way to the DMV area. This week, my guest is...
So my name is Dumi Right, coming out of a crew called Zimbabwe Legit, which was actually one of the first hip-hop crews coming out of Africa. Have worked with a lot of notables, Jungle Brothers, Prince Poe, Dead Prez, Breeze Everflowing, Sea Ray's Walls, Vast Air, and Chubb Rock.
Wondering why you did this to me. You said it's for the best, but I disagree. So many good times in history, but now you're gone, girl, like a mystery. I'm out here working, going berserking. Here for the bombing, pictures lurking, Facebook stalking, and public gawking. Ask you to stay, but like Christopher, you're walking.
Dumi is a standard bearer for global hip-hop who is not only talented, but very self-aware, saying that you should tell your story about who you are and what you do through hip-hop. The first inclination with a lot of them is to recycle stuff they've heard on the radio or seen on TV. No, because you're not a millionaire. You're not rolling in a fancy car. So who are you really? Drop the facade and talk about who you are. Have fun and gain confidence. We discussed the days in Zimbabwe, traveling to the U.S., and what a storied and long career looks like up through 2020. With such a solid hip-hop background and credentials, Dumi Right has been invited to perform at venues including the Kennedy Center, Smithsonian, Whitney Museum, and more. But before I get into it, this episode is supported by Substantial Art and Music, LLC, which is an organization focused on providing consulting services to the art and music community. Visit them at subartandmusic.com. And also, J57 and the whole 57 collective, JMO Gang, announces Walking with Lions LP featuring DJ Premier Slug and more, and it arrives in about a week, April 10th. It's available to pre-order now via Fat Beats. With that said, bedroombeethovens.com is another website you can go to. My website. Poke around, buy a shirt, sign up for the Patreon at Bedroom Beethovens, subscribe to the YouTube channel, leave me a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts, follow me on Spotify. Basically, just support the show. Whether it's donating $1 a month to show your love or just, leave a heart, a like on Instagram, or subscribe. Thank you all. We're over the hump. Episode 61. Let's keep the momentum going. Dumi Right, Bedroom Beethovens. Let's get it.
Mission accomplished.
First and foremost, as we peel back the layers and go through your story, I want to say RIP to your brother, the master DJ. He kind of got you into this culture.
Respect due, and I appreciate that. So RIP, my brother Mundla. Mundla is a Ndebele word which means power, and he definitely was a powerful source and inspiration. He passed away, some years back, but he's kind of the guy who brought me and brought us, referring to my other brother, into the hip hop scene and the music scene, since he was a DJ and had, collections of vinyl records and got us listening and interested in it and encouraged our progress and development.
Yeah. Now, if I say a sentence like Dumi got inspired by hip hop, started writing rhymes and learning how to produce, came over to the States and signed a deal. It makes it sound easy, but in the late 80s, early 90s, I mean, hip hop's fairly new. You can't just fly to American Idol and audition in front of Jennifer Lopez. You had to hustle.
Right.
So how did those chain of events come together?
Yeah, like you said, it's a super complicated process because when you think about just the correspondence, right? Like getting in touch with someone in the US that's in the music business, it was all through letters, snail mail, you're writing a letter, I forget 60 cents worth of postage and you mail it and you wait a couple weeks, right? You don't know if the person got it or not until you get another letter back from them in a couple weeks saying, hey, received your letter, really excited. So we actually would get copies of the Source magazine occasionally. And that's when the Source, late 80, like 89, I think this was around. So it was still, fledgling publication in black and white mostly. And there was a column called Gangsta Limping with Funk Incline. And he always at the end of his column say, yo, all my peoples all over the world that are doing hip hop and making music, let me know what's going on in your neck of the woods. And so we wrote back to him and said, yo, not only are we listening and really inspired by what's happening in hip hop and a lot of the Afrocentric rhymes and groups that were coming out at the time, we're also doing it. And he wrote back, some weeks later and was like, oh, word, y'all should let me hear something. And so we got some rough demos that we had cut in the studio that we mailed on cassette to him. And, some weeks later he responded and was like, yo, the stuff sounds really dope. If you're ever in the US, look me up and maybe something can happen. So at that point, it's just kind of a thought and an idea. And who would have known that it would have actually been able to manifest and unfold into, Zimbabwe Legit dropping a record on Hollywood Basic Records in 1992, some years subsequent to that, working with DJ Shadow and the Black Sheep on production on that first EP.
Yeah, I wanted to talk about the Hollywood Basic, the label. It was Hollywood's short-lived hip-hop subsidiary, like movie-making Hollywood, and it accidentally just had these iconic moments, but it was some weird ones as well. They put a hip-hop remix of Queen tracks. They even had Ice Cube on it. They had a Lifers group, which was a hip-hop group composed of...
out of Rahway Prison of real lifers. Yeah. And they recorded it in Rahway Prison.
Don't know if that was a good idea. and you know what's cool? If you're a big fan of Stone's Throw, MF Doom, Madlib, etc., Peanut Butter Wolf, and Charisma were on that label. But when Charisma got murdered, all of their music was trashed, and he got frustrated. So Peanut Butter Wolf left and created Stone's Throw. So the ripple effect that the oddities of that label is responsible for is pretty insane.
Yeah, and I mean, they had Organized Confusion was the first group that Funk Incline signed, and we all know, the history there on to the present. And actually, when we first signed with them and we went on tour for the first time to Japan, we went with Organized. So we flew on the plane from New York to Japan on that long flight, hanging with Prince Poe and Pharoah Monch, talking, building, and really learning because we were new to the game at that point and real new to the industry. And myself had just recently come back to the US as well. So it was crazy experience, crazy times.
I heard Organized Confusion, like everyone else lost their music and the recordings except for them.
That could be. It was like a crazy situation because Hollywood Basic, like you said, subsidiary of the Walt Disney Company, go figure. Like Organized has a classic line where I think Prince Poe says, because I'm tricky in a joust because I'm down with Mickey Mouse. But there was a lot of frustrations with the label. You know how industry things happen. And I think there was also a lot of push from the parent company to be like, we need to make money. We need... I remember the label folks telling us that they're pushing them to find the next Crisscross. Like they wanted this mega pop hit, right? And they had a whole bunch of crazy, unique, unorthodox, dope groups. And the, main label was pushing. So anyway, when the label folded, unfortunately, the founder passed away. He'd been battling spinal issues and a whole bunch of stuff. So that's why he was called Gangsta Limping. He was in a wheelchair a lot of the times, or walking with a cane. But once his health had started to decline and, other forces came into play and the label was basically, on its last legs, a lot of the stuff musically, like we couldn't get calls back. People weren't getting stuff promoted. People weren't getting access to the record. People were like, yo, we want to play it. How can we get it? So there's just a whole lot of stuff happening in and around that. When it eventually closed its doors, it's like I'd call and people would be like, who? Who's this? Who do you want to speak to? Oh, yeah, that label's not here anymore. So it was kind of like, gone in a flash.
That's how you found out?
I mean, we were just, and again, you got to realize too, we're talking, early 90s to the mid 90s. And so it's not like now where it's like, oh, let me go on the website and let me email this guy. And, it's like, and so I'm calling people from college because I was in college at the time, calling Collect. And I remember it was funny because Dave had been like, yeah, I know you're a college student. Just call me Collect. And I called and they're like, we don't accept Collect calls. Who's this call? Which was weird at the time, but that was kind of the beginnings of the end.
Wow. Are you familiar with a zine called The Bomb?
The Bomb, yes. I'm familiar with them. I think we might have done something with them, either a write-up or review or something back in those days.
Yeah, all the names that we've dropped, it can't be a coincidence because for people that don't know, The Bomb was a hip-hop zine in 1992. It was kind of Xerox style. It included work by Charisma and Peanut Butter Wolf. DJ Shadow wrote for it, who helped produce one of your first records. And of course, Funkenklein was working there. And that zine took a shot at the source, which caused a source editor to call it the zine, and they called it a cobbled, stapled together piece of crap.
I hadn't heard that story, but yeah, that sounds about right.
Blazing reflections of Africanisms are coming back.
Yeah, it's funny because, Dave Klein started it all and the Disney-led Hollywood records after the source. So if we look at the butterfly effect of it all, if you would have graduated high school like a year later, you probably would have missed your shot. You might have wrote to the source, but a different editor would have read the letter or thrown it in the trash. So, I mean, they say opportunity is just kind of luck and being in the right place and all that. So,
yeah, opportunity and preparation. And it was funny because when we started corresponding with him, he was like, oh yeah, I'll send you some promos. And, he sent us some Jungle Brothers shirts and, some 12 inches. And I think the Queen Latifah Ladies First was one of them, and Straight Out of the Jungle and some other records. And he was working at Red Alert Productions in New York City. And so when we met with him, we went to 29th Street, caught the bus. We were upstate New York to Port Authority, throwing our dashikis and our beads and strolled down 8th Avenue over to 29th Street to Red Alert Productions, and sat down with him to have our first meeting and talk about what would be or what would end up being Zimbabwe Legit.
Yeah, that's dope. So we have yourself, we have your brother, and now we have your cousin Pep. So everyone's got the rap bug. And
it's actually funny. So if we rewind a couple years, when we were in Zimbabwe, my brother and my cousin Pep were the cats on the forefront of the scene, rapping and getting on the radio and doing stuff. I had started on the dance tip, so I had done dance contests and stuff, and ended up
Master Force.
Yeah. Oh, so you did a lot of research on this. Exactly. So we're in a crew called Master Force, and so we'd have battles downtown in the main street of the city center in Harare, the capital city of Zimbabwe, and we'd battle other crews. On Saturday afternoons. And then we saw movies like Beat Street and Breakdance, which were huge inspirations. And those guys, like my brother and Pep, were really at the forefront in rapping. I was a big writer at the time, but I was a lot younger too. So a lot of times they'd go to clubs or go to spots to do stuff, and I'd be too young to get in. You'd have to be 16 and I wouldn't be old enough or stuff like that. But it was definitely a burgeoning hip-hop scene and a vibrant hip-hop scene that we were trying to gain access to and do our thing way over in the motherland.
Well, so this is back in the days of DJ Mixmaster Ice with Shantae's Marley Marl, the Roxanne saga, the Bridge Wars.
Yep, definitely.
You know what's crazy? She retired from rap and she's now a clinical psychologist.
Wow. It's amazing how things go.
Yo, EMD? Yeah, what's up, man? Think that girl they call Roxanne. She's all stuck up. Why you say that? Cause you wouldn't give a guy like me no rap. Man, she was walking down the street, so I said, hello, I'm can't go from the TFO. And she so, I said, so, baby, don't you know I can sing, rap, dance in just one show? Cause I'm can't go.
But yeah, I remember, so like the Roxanne Wars, like we'd always get our information secondhand. And so somebody would have a tape, and he'd be like, yo, this is the real Roxanne.
Ice.
Or we're like, well, who's the other Roxanne? And we're trying to unpack the whole story and figure it out. But a lot of the ways we got access to the music and understood what was happening and what the latest was, you know, friends overseas, cousins or brother or sister, you know, would record a mix show and mail you the cassette. And then those cassettes would spread far and wide, right? Because it's like, oh, my cousin just got this new cassette. Let me go over to his house and let me dub it. You know, and somebody would get a dub of a dub, or you trade off records and mix shows. So we heard like DJ Red Alert going berserk on Kiss FM, you know, through cassettes, not lots of shows, but an occasional show. We heard Westwood, Fresh Start to the Week from the UK, from people who had connections over there. So we'd hear different artists and, you know, kind of get a window and insight into what was happening in hip hop.
Well, so when you came over for, like, I guess your record deal or your opportunity, you're simultaneously going to college as well, right?
Yep.
Where did you go and what did you study?
So I went to Virginia Tech, and I was a liberal arts. So I studied English, communications, and technology education.
And shout out to WVT College Radio.
Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed. So while I was at Tech, obviously being a music man, worked at the radio station, worked my way up to urban music director, started DJing on AM, which was like awful, like nobody listened, right? But that's where you had to cut your teeth for at least a semester. But it was great because you'd have piles and piles of promo records from all these labels. So sometimes it would just be, you know, listening through stuff and, you know, all these white labels and all these releases and, you know, reading up and learning about what was going on and getting records from all over the country too.
Well, I mean, so you're in the U.S. I mean, you're kind of entrenched in college culture and networking. But in the late '80s, like, what did music mean to people in Zimbabwe? Because I imagine if you catch wind of Grandmaster Flash, it's like a peek into a different world because everyone says America the Beautiful. But if you know nothing of the U.S. and you hear Grandmaster Flash talking about broken glass everywhere, hip hop starts to paint a different kind of picture, as the American cliches will lead you to believe.
Oh yeah, that's a great point. Because that kind of hip hop basically kind of gave us a window into like the subculture and counterculture and things that were really happening. You know, it's that live report from the Bronx or from wherever the MC was speaking from or speaking about. And so, you know, we heard songs like the Sugar Hill Gang and everything like that. But then you hear things like Public Enemy. And you're starting to hear, you know, about like race relations in America. And you hear things, you know, like, you know, the Grandmaster Flash record. And then as time went on, I remember when Ice-T Colors dropped and like we had no idea like about gang culture and gang warfare. And so it was really like, you know, moving and striking and kind of inspiring to be like, oh, so that's what's going on over there. Yeah, I'd have never, you know, things here happen, but totally different, you know, totally different aspect, you know, kind of the territories and all of that. And then I remember the first time we heard Straight Outta Compton, and like it was mystifying because it was, you know, a lot of rap at that point, at least the rap we were listening to, was more on the progressive and positive and uplifting tip. And then when NWA came out, it was like, whoa, you know, but at the same time, they were talking about real life stories and trials and tribulations that people go through in urban areas, in the city and in the hood. And you're like, wow, like, you know, this is real. Like, this is not, you know, everything is gravy and, you know, wave the flag and everybody's happy and, you know, it's all copacetic. It's like there's real stuff happening. People are having real challenges. And I think rap is probably the only vehicle that could communicate that to us at that distance, right? The news stories aren't necessarily going to talk about gang violence in LA, right? Because they're talking about local news or regional news. But through hip hop, we were like getting insights from all over the US and kind of hearing about stuff, you know, without any other access. Again, before the prevalence of the internet and the World Wide Web and YouTube.
But it's arguable that the ghetto vernacular practiced by many African American rappers has become so atrophied in its relentless repetition of a severely limited range of curse words that any claims for resistance has long passed their use-by date. So as you've matured, you realize this as well, because like curse words can be a distraction from the message. They're filler words.
Yeah, it's like a crutch, right? It's a lot of times when you're doing like a workshop or doing exercises and working with like younger kids or whatever, high school kids, they'll go to that as a go-to, one, because it's easy and they've heard it a million times, so it's easy to pull it out, especially if you're trying to improv. But it's an easy way out, right? If I don't have a point to make, I can just curse, right? For shock value or just to say something, just to bridge the gap to the next thing that I'm going to say. And the thing that I guess I realized too, it's like the power you have with the words just from the experience that I had and knowing that continues, right? People all over the world, especially now, are checking out what people are saying and it's influencing them in one way or another. And so it's not like a burden, but it's something that just should be taken with weight, right? It's not just like you can't just take this thing lightly because it's so powerful, right? It's like you've been granted these powers and you can use them for good or you can use them for evil or, whatever. But it's kind of important to do something with what you've got. One of my favorite songs is or phrases is from the Far Side. I gotta kick something that means something, something that means something, something that means something, just because like it's so important. This ain't no time when the usual is suitable, to quote my man Mos Def.
For sure. I guess it depends on who was saying that, because when revolutionary music like maybe Cop Killer came out, people were bulldozing the CDs and white politicians were up in arms. When we make revolutionary music, hip hop's marginality is as official, as routinized as its overblown defiance, yet it is still represented as an outlaw form, especially back in the 90s, like we talked about. If you're making revolutionary music, because you only have 3 to 4 minutes to do a song, half of which is a chorus, your message can become oversimplified or more usually ignored by its academic celebrants. So when you make music with a message, how do you approach it to where it's celebrated by the far side but ostracized by someone like Ice-T and NWA? I mean, who do you have in mind when you're making this music?
So a lot of what I think I've learned, like I think when we started out, we had a message and we were talking about the African perspective, and we kind of expected, very naively that, everyone's going to be, hey, we're talking about conscious stuff, and not realizing that there's some people who either will be threatened by it or will be opposed to it for one reason or another. I think as I've matured, I kind of realized, one, not to come out and be like, you're wrong, this is how it should be. And so I'm kind of more strategic, I think, and subtle. You know what I mean? Nobody wants you in their face trying to tell them, this is what you should do, right? I don't think that's the most effective form of communication. But I think you also have to relate to people where they are and make a message that's relatable, and also speak from your own personal experience, right? Because if you're telling somebody, this is what I went through, this is how I felt, and this is how I dealt with it, and this was the outcome, this is what I see happening, this is how I want my family to be, this is how I see youth responding to what I do in your music, people will relate to it that are in that situation. And people that can't relate won't necessarily be, offended by it, or necessarily because you're not calling them out, so to speak. You're just saying, hey, this is how it is for me. And I always think like, when people are rapping about whatever subject, glorifying materialism or whatever, and that's their prerogative to do, they're not shy about it, right? But when people are, so-called conscious, a lot of times it's like, well, I don't want to be labeled conscious because I don't want people. And it's like, well, the cats that are rapping about everything else are proud, you know what I mean? They're standing on it. They're going to die on that hill. And so it's like, if this is the hill that I'm going to die on, I'm going to be proud to say what I'm saying because I mean it. And it's real to me and the people around me and the people that I want to influence. And, when I look at my kids and see, how they respond to music and what they listen to, like, I want to make sure that the legacy that I'm putting forth and what I'm saying is something that I can be proud of. And I don't want to be like, oh man, why did I do that? Like, I sold my soul.
I mean, authenticity is great, but let's say you release a song with Justin Bieber and Drake. Now you're following trends. Is there any way to do a song with Post Malone without compromising who you are as an artist? Like, can you have your cake and eat it too, or that's going to start affecting who you are as an artist, and it's just not worth it?
I'll think about it in the way of, I remember in the 90s where people were like, yo, real hip hop, and Outkast came out and people were trying to, at least around where I was, be like, yo, that's not the real hip hop they're doing. And it's like, no, but they're telling a story from their perspective. Like Andre said, the South got something to say. And so if you would have done a collabo with them, and I think, down years later, obviously Raekwon rocked with Outkast and that kind of stuff. But a lot of times purists want you to just stick to what stick to your knitting, stick to what you're doing, and don't do anything with other folks. But I find that collaboration productive a lot of times. And I think a lot of times it's done from a marketing standpoint. Oh, he's got a big fan base. Let's hop on and try to get his fans. But I think when it's not authentic, what you do a lot of times is alienate your core fans. And so maybe the single hits, maybe it doesn't. Many instances where like my favorite artist has put out a song and it's like, what? Like, yo, that dance joint, that's not you at all. And hopefully you can recover from it. Might be like, oh, why is he rocking with him? Like, that's like, and so it's like a lose-lose situation where, as opposed to the plan was you thought you were going to win both audiences and you might lose them all.
I mean, the greatest compliment I can give you is how you've navigated, decades of staying relevant. Because when I think of Brand Nubian, King Son, Public Enemy, I mean, I hate to say this, but it seems like Afrocentric rap was a trend because I'm not seeing that kind of message anymore.
And I think a lot of what it is, and like I'll have this debate with folks where they'll be like, oh, the music is out there. You just have to dig and find it. But I mean, if you have kids or you're around youth, you know that they're generally consuming what's out in the mass media, right? I mean, they're not necessarily going on YouTube to dig and be like, what's the latest from? They may not know the artists. They may not have heard of them. And the other stuff is right there. They can hear it. Their friends are listening to it. And so it's sad when, you used to hear Public Enemy blasting on, mainstream radio. You'd hear Tribe Called Quest 3:00 in the afternoon. I'm visiting my sister in Cincinnati and they're playing Check the Rhyme, mid-afternoon on the mix shows or whatever on the radio. Whereas now stuff that I think talks about consciousness, talks about progressive causes, kind of gets relegated to the side in favor of the more commercial stuff. And so I think a lot of these artists are still rocking and they just get their money and their shine touring. A lot of overseas audiences, unfortunately, are more receptive than US audiences to a lot of these artists, a lot of the classic artists, a lot of golden age artists, make a killing overseas and pack shows. And, at home, it's like that old adage, a prophet's not accepted in their hometown. It's like at home, people are, checking for the latest, Drake joint or whatever. And it's unfortunate, but I guess in order to keep doing it, I think I kind of tend to also think outside the box in terms of where I perform, the things that I do, staying active, getting involved in like cultural exchange, working with schools.
What was that? Prophets aren't well received in their hometown. What was that quote?
Prophet is never, accepted in his hometown, meaning a lot
That's
of
deep,
times,
man. And that's so
you
true.
go elsewhere and people are celebrating you, right? I remember Asheru talking about him going overseas to do a show and having like hundreds of people literally before the show even started gathering in the parking lot and him thinking like, yo, what's the deal? Like, this is great. It would be great if that was the same, reception, around the way.
You know who else had that experience? Lamont Dozier.
Oh, okay.
He had a really interesting perspective since he has, decades of experience as well as producing in Motown. He would return to his old neighborhood and see his old buddies. Like, you go down there with one thing in mind, thinking your old friends are going to feel good about it and be happy for you, but it's just the opposite. They thought that he was down there slumming or trying to make himself look better than them, but that wasn't it. The point was he wanted to go there and give them some get up and go. Like, hey man, I did this and you can too. But they took it like he was trying to make them look bad, and it really hurt him. So, now that your friends have graduated in high school who may not have had $1 in a dream and sent a letter to a record executive they saw in a Source magazine and got a record deal, do you get a lot of hate from people who were either jealous or thought maybe you were abandoning them for the DMV area?
The thing that's funny about that, and like, obviously living over here and, only traveling back, not as frequently as I'd have liked to, but getting back, early on, I wondered, like, what's the reaction? How do people feel? Are they like, yo, those cats are representing us? I mean, we put a country on our back, like through the name, like Zimbabwe Legit. Like you can't miss that we're repping for the country. And it's been interesting because I'll run into people who'll be like, yo, when that song Doing Damage came out, it was so inspiring because you guys were rapping in English and in Ndebele, and that was new and fresh, and it gave me like, a vision of what I could do. And I'm actually collaborating with a young cat now, and he in Zimbabwe, and he's like, yo, everything that you do, just actually being able to build with you now after having seen you kind of set the path, and blaze a trail, was inspiring. And so when I hear that, you know what I mean, there's nothing better, no better feeling than knowing that what we did back then impacted folks. People are always like, yeah, we weren't sure, are they really from Zimbabwe, or were they just saying that? And then we read the history and we realized that you guys really were. And, so they kind of view it as like we were ambassadors of, the movement, African hip hop movement, which has, obviously blossomed and grown, a millionfold since then. But getting that feedback is kind of, what it's all about for me.
I mean, of course, in present day, everyone understands the grand vision of Zimbabwe Legit was to bring your cultural understanding and influence into the music. But maybe people felt like you could have done that without leaving.
The one thing about that is we tried to have inroads in the local industry. And at that point, there was no hip hop industry. But even just like any other music besides traditional, locally, just didn't. I mean, we met with some folks that were at like the one label that was putting out records locally. They kind of didn't get what we were trying to do. Same experience with a number of other folks that were trying to do even like R&B or any other styles. It was kind of like, well, it's not local. It's not going to sell. You're abandoning your roots. So that's kind of from the older, kind of set in their ways generation that were running the show back then. We didn't have the best like studio infrastructure. I know the places we did our recordings, we were never really super satisfied with. So it was almost impossible back then to do anything really with the music we were making. There was like a radio show where I mentioned my brother and my cousin had got on and stuff, but it was like a once in a week thing. And it was at the whim of that DJ because he was kind of the only one, the gatekeeper controlling stuff. And so we really didn't have a way to do anything locally, which is good that now it's different. There's folks that are trying to do it. But in a lot of places, I think the biggest challenge in a place like Zimbabwe, in like a developing country, is there's economic hardship from, that's way beyond what a lot of us are used to. And so thinking about making music commercially and making money is a pretty tall ordeal, pretty tall endeavor to try to do, because people are worried about food and rent, and you're trying to hustle some music and make some money. And so people do it in different ways. I think the South African music scene, they've been able to commercialize it a lot more because there is a lot more disposable income. Huge disparity in wealth, but there are people that do have spend, and there are companies and commercial entities that have been able to exploit it.
I kind of wanted to explore that a little bit because on your latest track, you rhyme, looking for someone of something we can believe in. What we need is justice and someone held accountable. Gonna make it even though the odds are insurmountable. And if I focus on Zimbabwe, we have Emerson Mnangagwa, who is nicknamed the Crocodile, whose opposition leader mysteriously died in a U.S. helicopter. Before him, we had a 37-year rule of Robert Mugabe, who turned the country into an economic disaster zone. Elections in Zimbabwe have always been marred by political violence and disputes. And please don't get me started on Donald Trump in the United States. But man, like Dumi, you must be tired, man, because you've been screaming for change for decades, and sometimes it must be hard to see the light.
Yeah, no, and it's funny that you draw that parallel, because I always say it. I'm like, hey, we want free and fair elections. We don't want tampering in elections. We don't want irregularities. We don't want conflicts of interest. We don't want a president that's enriching themselves using their office. And it's like, wait, are you talking about America? Are you talking about Zimbabwe? Previously people would laugh and be like, oh, those African countries are, their politicians are corrupt and there's all this corruption, right? But like, hey, look in the mirror, look at what's happening right here at home. But yeah, it's tough. Like, I remember talking to one of my uncles in Zimbabwe, and I was like, hey, I'm wishing you well, and I wish, hopefully there's a light at the end of the tunnel. And he's like, well, there would be, but we don't have electricity. Like, there's power outages during the day. There's just so many challenges that people are facing with, trying to come up and just trying to survive. Prices skyrocketing. So you can imagine now there's a crisis with oil here. Before all of this popped off, there was petrol shortages and people were lining up to get gas, or petrol as they call it there, at gas stations, for hours and hours, and, stations running out, and, foreign currency exchange problems. So it's been a long time, and things haven't really gotten better. There have been spots of brightness, and then there have been real spots of real darkness, and a lot of challenges with politics, with infrastructure, with development, a lot of frustration for artists, because you can imagine, again, the government is not funding arts programs if people don't have electricity, right? There's bigger fish to fry, and a lot of those critical needs are not being met. So it's tough. It's tough, man. But I feel like if I use my voice, if I use my platform to express what's going on, and show solidarity with the people that are going through troubles, domestically as well as back in Zimbabwe, maybe it makes a difference, or maybe it gives people hope or inspiration, and maybe we're able to find ways to make changes.
It sucks because, especially if you want to get on a concert series and they say you got to bring your own equipment and they don't pay you. So the organizers don't even value your time, your talent. And as a whole, it diminishes who you are and what you're trying to accomplish.
Yeah. And I mean, sometimes, you know what I mean? It's good to be, hustle and, get your gear. Sometimes it's nice to just be an artist, man. You know what I mean? And, be creative, not be encumbered by, the technical limitations and the equipment and the fights with the promoters, and just perform and bring something beautiful to people, you know what I mean? And share your spirit and your words and progress and development, and to have all that other stuff holding you back from doing, what needs to be done. It's a shame.
America's weird, man. I mean, one day you're playing at the Kennedy Center and the next day you're trying to buy a car and the salesperson doesn't give you the time of day.
I'm telling you, right? Like, it's no regard, no regard.
Man, you've come a long way from beginning work as a systems analyst, man. That's for sure. All right.
No, definitely.
So we got the new single with Chubb Rock. We got the remix by Mr. Liff. I'm going to give you the floor, man, to let the people know what's ahead for you in 2020.
Yeah, so really I'm excited about this single, We Don't Need. Like we said, it's timely. And I've always loved Chubb Rock. And he totally, you got to listen to the track, but he totally puts the current administration on blast for what's really going on. But a dope beat by my man, First Spawn, real head nodder, and and a dope hook, my homie Nathaniel Starr, who's just a great vocalist and real cool brother that I've recently started collaborating with. So that single's out on all digital platforms. People can stream it, they can cop it, kind of on any of the sites where you listen to music. And it's real fun. I'm working on that single. The other single that just dropped on Monday, so a couple of days ago, was called Nightfall, the remix, featuring Mr. Liff, also another real dope lyricist. And all these songs are basically working up towards the release of a full-length album that I'll have coming out later this year. Real different sounding too. Like, some have vocalists, some have just hard stripped down beats, some are real thoughtful and introspective. The next song I have coming up, This Is My Calling, kind of just encompasses my journey from beginning to end. And just, continuing to put out music. Like I said, I'm taking my music to traditional clubs and bars, that scene, as well as non-traditional venues. So, expect me to pop up anywhere and everywhere. I actually just got contracted to do a tour series at the local Fairfax County libraries because they saw what we did and they said, well, there's a lot of our audience that might not necessarily either make it to the Kennedy Center or make it to like the 930 Club or Union Stage, but they'd love to hear and see what you do. So we did a pilot show last year that went really well, really well received. We basically, brought hip hop to the library. Go figure, right? It's like quiet, please, not for the next hour. So they've got like resource rooms that are off, from the main annex of the library, and we also get all ages in those shows too. Like, people were bringing their kids. There's grown folks, big, wide variety of people in the audience. And we basically did our thing. I had, the bass player, I had the DJ, I had vocalists, I brought dancers in there. It's kind of like we'll do the whole show. We're not going to half step, and just give y'all a taste. We're going to give y'all the whole thing, or as much as fits into a 100-person resource room at any rate.
I'm glad to see you busy and active as ever. The world needs more of you, your music, and quite frankly, just the way you think, because we get 10 Waka Flockas for every one Dumi Right nowadays. I'm just happy we're able to sit down and talk, man.
No, I appreciate it, man. This has been cool. And I just feel blessed to be able to still do it. And so I know your platform is super important. I'm super appreciative that you let me be on it and we could chop it up. I'm super impressed that you had all the in-depth info in the background. Like, that's always a pleasure when you're talking to somebody and they're not like, so did you drop your first album last year and stuff? So, I respect due. Salute for that, man. I appreciate it and appreciate being able to tell my story. You know what I mean? I don't take it for granted. And I love that, somebody out there be able to hear it and, take something away from it.